The town of Rahid Creek didn't announce its cruelty with violence. It did so with laughter, low and cutting, the kind that followed a woman when she crossed the street with her head down and her shoulders bent under the weight of other people's judgment. Martha Hale knew that sound well. She was the woman they looked past. Broad across the back, thick in the middle, with hands that had gone red and rough from years of work that never seemed to end. Her face carried no softness that men found pleasing, no delicate feature that made women jealous. She was simply there, solid, plain, easy to ignore. And when she wasn't ignored, she was mocked. The boarding house sat at the end of Main Street, a two-story structure that smelled of boiled cabbage and tobacco smoke. Martha worked there 6 days a week, sometimes 7 when the owner decided she owed extra hours for some imagined failure. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles split. She hauled water until her back screamed. She served meals to men who never looked at her face, only at what she placed in front of them. The cowboys were the worst. They came in loud, dusty from the trail, flush with pay they hadn't yet drunk away. They sprawled in chairs, boots on tables, hats pushed back, eyes sharp for anything they could turn into sport. And Martha, slow-moving, silent Martha, was an easy target. "Look at the size of her," one said once, not even bothering to lower his voice. "Like a plow horse. Bet she could pull a wagon if you hitched her right." The others laughed. Martha kept her eyes on the pot she was scrubbing, her jaw tight, her breathing careful. The owner, Mrs. Garvin, stood in the doorway and said nothing. The cowboy's money was good. Martha's dignity was not. It happened again and again. A joke about her size. A comment about her face. Laughter that followed her down the hall. She learned to make herself smaller in ways that had nothing to do with her body. She kept her voice low. Her movements are quiet. She never met anyone's eyes unless they demanded it, and even then, only briefly. The town had decided what she was worth, and she had learned not to argue. Winter came early that year, bringing with it a cold that settled deep into the bones and didn't let go. The boarding house filled up with drifters and trappers coming down from the high country, men who smelled of pine and wood smoke and something wild that didn't belong in town. Martha worked longer hours. Her pay stayed the same. Mrs. Garvin docked her $1 for breaking a plate, another 50 cents for being slow with the laundry. Martha didn't complain. Complaining only made things worse. One evening, she was carrying a basin of dirty water toward the back door when she heard the familiar sound, boots scraping, voices rising with that edge of cruelty men got when they'd been drinking and wanted entertainment. "Hey, big girl. Where are you off to in such a hurry?" She kept walking. "Talking to you, darlin', . She reached for the door handle. A hand caught her arm, not rough, but firm enough to stop her. Another man stepped in front of the door, grinning. "Ah, don't be shy now. Just want to see if you're as sturdy as you look." Martha's heart hammered. She kept her eyes down, her voice steady. "Let me pass. Let me pass," one of them mimicked in a high, mocking tone. The others laughed. She tried to pull free. The grip tightened. Then a voice cut through the noise, low, quiet, and edged with something that made the laughter stop. "Step back." The voice came from the shadows near the kitchen door, and it carried no anger, no heat, just a flatness that somehow felt more dangerous than shouting. The cowboys turned. The man standing there was tall but not towering, lean in the way of someone who lived on what he could carry. His coat was patched leather, his beard dark and streaked with gray, and his eyes sat deep beneath heavy brows, watchful and still. He smelled of cold air and pine pitch. Martha had seen him before. He'd taken a room 2 days ago, paid in cash, spoken to no one. Jonah Pike. A trapper. A mountain man. The kind of person the town tolerated but never welcomed. One of the cowboys, emboldened by drink and the presence of his friends, sneered. "This ain't your business, old man." Jonah didn't move. "It is now." We're just having a little fun. No, Jonah said quietly. You're not. The cowboy's grin faltered. Something in the way Jonah stood, still as stone, hands loose at his sides, eyes fixed and unblinking, made the air feel heavier. He wasn't posturing. He wasn't threatening. He was simply present, immovable, and that was somehow worse than fury. She doesn't mind, another cowboy tried. Do you, sweetheart? Martha said nothing. Her throat had gone tight. Jonah's gaze shifted to her briefly, then back to the men. Let her go. Or what? Jonah tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. When he spoke, his voice remained low, almost conversational. Or you'll find out what kind of man doesn't need to be loud to be heard. The silence stretched. The cowboy holding Martha's arm glanced at his friends, looking for support, for backup, for someone to tell him this wasn't as unsettling as it felt. No one moved. Jonah simply waited, patient as the mountains he came from. The cowboy let go. Martha pulled her arm back, clutching the basin against her chest. The men shuffled, muttered something about not being worth the trouble, and moved past her toward the front room. Their laughter didn't return. Jonah watched them go, then turned his attention to Martha. His expression didn't soften, it simply existed, unreadable and calm. You all right? Martha nodded, unable to find her voice. He studied her for a moment longer, then stepped aside, giving her a clear path to the door. She moved quickly, dumping the water outside, her hands trembling as the cold air hit her face. When she came back in, Jonah was gone. But something had shifted. Over the next few days, Martha became aware of him in ways she hadn't noticed other guests. He didn't speak much, didn't join the card games or the drinking. He ate his meals quickly and without complaint, always nodding his thanks when she brought his plate. He never stared. Never leered. Never spoke to her unless necessary. And yet, the cowboys gave her space now. Mrs. Garvin still snapped orders and docked her pay, but the jeering stopped. The hands that had reached for her no longer did. It wasn't protection, exactly. It was something quieter. A boundary that had been drawn without words, respected because the man who drew it carried a weight the others recognized instinctively, the kind of authority that didn't come from a badge or a loud voice, but from something older and harder to name. Martha didn't know what to make of it. She only knew that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she walked through the boarding house without bracing for cruelty. It was a small mercy. But in a town like Rahid Creek, small mercies were all anyone like her ever got. And even those, she'd learned, never lasted long. The first time they spoke beyond necessity, it was evening. The boarding house had emptied out, most of the men gone to the saloon, the remaining few already asleep in their rooms. Martha sat on the back steps with a cup of weak coffee, letting the cold air soothe the ache in her shoulders. She didn't hear him approach. He simply appeared at the edge of the porch, hands in his pockets, looking out toward the darkening hills. Mind if I sit? Martha glanced up, startled. It's a free step. Jonah lowered himself onto the far end, leaving space between them. For a while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was the kind that existed between people who understood that words weren't always necessary. Finally, Martha said, "You didn't have to do that. The other night." "I know. They'll hold it against you." Jonah shrugged. "Let them." She studied him sidelong, the scars on his knuckles, the weathered lines around his eyes, the way he held himself like someone who'd stopped worrying about what others thought a long time ago. "Why did you?" she asked. He took a moment to answer. "Because it was wrong. Simple as that. No grand speech. No claim to nobility. Just a fact, delivered without decoration." Martha looked down at her coffee. Most people don't care what's wrong if it doesn't cost them anything to ignore it. Most people aren't worth knowing. A faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, small, brief, but real. It felt strange on her face, like a muscle she'd forgotten how to use. Over the following days, their conversations grew. Not long, not deep, just exchanges that happened naturally when paths crossed. Jonah mentioned that yarrow root could ease a cough. Martha told him where to find the cheapest tobacco in town. He asked if she knew how to mend leather. She showed him a stitch her father had taught her years ago, before he died and left her with nothing but the need to survive. They were both outsiders, she realized. Different kinds, but outsiders all the same. He by choice, living in the wild places where people were scarce and judgment scarcer. She by circumstance, trapped in a town that had decided her value and wouldn't let her argue. There was no romance in it. No heated glances or whispered promises. Just two people who recognized something familiar in each other, the shape of loneliness, the weight of being unseen. One evening, Jonah brought her a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a pair of leather gloves, worn but well made, lined with rabbit fur. "Your hands," he said simply. "They're splitting." Martha stared at the gloves, something tight forming in her chest. "I can't pay you for these." "Didn't ask you to." "Why would you?" "Because you need them," Jonah said, his tone unchanged. "And I don't." She took the gloves carefully, as if they might vanish if she held them too tightly. No one had given her anything in years, not without expecting something in return, not without making her feel smaller for needing it. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jonah nodded and stood to leave. At the door, he paused. "You're stronger than they think you are." Martha looked up sharply, but he was already gone. She sat there in the cold, holding the gloves, and felt something crack open inside her chest, not breaking, but shifting. A small seed of something she'd thought long dead. Not hope, exactly. But maybe the memory of what hope had once felt like. And in a life as hard as hers, even a memory was enough to hold on to. Mrs. Garvin noticed the gloves. She noticed everything that might suggest Martha was becoming less desperate, less controllable. The next morning, she called Martha into the kitchen with a sharp tone that left no room for argument. "You've been slacking," Mrs. Garvin said, arms crossed over her thin chest. "Meals late. Floors poorly scrubbed. I've had complaints." Martha kept her face neutral. "From who?" "Doesn't matter from who. What matters is you're not doing the work I pay you for. I've done every task you've given me. Don't talk back." Mrs. Garvin's eyes narrowed. "You're getting ideas above your station. I've seen you talking to that trapper. Think because some drifter looks at you twice, you're something special now?" The words landed like they were meant to, sharp, cutting, designed to put Martha back in the place the town had carved out for her. A month ago, they would have worked. A month ago, Martha would have swallowed them, apologized, and worked harder for less. But something had changed. "I do my work," Martha said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I do it well. And if you're going to dock my pay again for something I didn't do wrong, then say so plainly." Mrs. Garvin's face flushed red. "How dare you?" "I dare because it's true." The silence that followed was brittle and sharp. Mrs. Garvin stepped closer, her voice dropping to something low and venomous. "You think you have choices? You think anyone else in this town would hire you? You're lucky I keep you on at all." Martha felt the old fear rise, the terror of having nothing, being nothing, disappearing into the kind of poverty that killed slowly and without mercy. But beneath it, something else stirred. The memory of Jonah standing quiet and unmovable. The weight of the gloves on her hands. The realization that she'd survived this long not because Mrs. Garvin was generous, but because Martha was strong. "Then I quit," Martha said. The words came out before she'd fully decided to say them, but once spoken, they felt right. Terrifyingly right. Mrs. Garvin laughed, a harsh, disbelieving sound. "You quit? And where? Do what?" "I don't know yet," Martha admitted. But I know I won't stay here and let you treat me like I'm worthless. You are worthless. Martha met her eyes, fully, directly, without flinching. No. I'm not. She walked out of the kitchen, up the narrow stairs to the cramped room she shared with two other women, and gathered her belongings. They fit into a single bundle: 2 dresses, an extra pair of stockings, the gloves Jonah had given her, and a cast-iron skillet her mother had left her. Everything she owned in the world, and it weighed almost nothing. When she came back down, Mrs. Garvin was waiting, arms still crossed, face twisted with contempt. You'll come crawling back within a week. They always do. Martha didn't answer. She stepped out into the cold morning air, her bundle clutched against her chest, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She had no plan. No savings. No place to go. But she had herself, her strength, her hands, her refusal to be small anymore. She found Jonah outside the general store, loading supplies onto a packhorse. When he saw her, his eyes moved from her face to the bundle in her arms, reading the situation without needing explanation. You left, he said. I left. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Good. Martha's breath caught. I don't know what to do now. Jonah finished securing a rope, then turned to face her fully. I'm heading back up to the high country tomorrow. Got a cabin where the spruce meets the stone. Winter's coming hard. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Life up there's harder than down here. Colder. Hungrier. Lonelier. But it's honest. And it's yours if you want it. Martha stared at him, her mind racing through a dozen questions she couldn't form into words. Jonah seemed to understand. I'm not offering rescue, he said quietly. I'm offering partnership. You'd work hard. Harder than you've worked here. And there's no guarantee we'd make it through the winter. But nobody up there will treat you the way this town does. Why would you do this? Martha asked. You barely know me. I know enough. Jonah adjusted the pack on his horse, his movements deliberate and unhurried. I know you're strong. I know you're capable. And I know you deserve better than what you've been given. He looked at her directly. But understand, I'm not asking you to come for me. I'm asking if you want to choose a different kind of life. The choice is yours. Martha felt the weight of the moment settle over her like snow. Behind her was Rahid Creek, familiar, cruel, predictable. Ahead was the unknown, frightening, uncertain, but hers to shape. She thought of the gloves. The quiet conversations. The way Jonah had stood between her and cruelty without expecting gratitude or reward. I'll come, she said. They left before dawn the next morning, when the town was still sleeping and the sky was the color of old iron. Martha walked beside the packhorse, her bundle tied to the saddle, her breath forming clouds in the frozen air. Jonah moved ahead, reading the land with the ease of someone who'd spent more years in wilderness than in civilization. The trail climbed steadily. By midday, Martha's legs burned. By evening, her back ached in ways that made the boarding house labor seem gentle. Jonah set a hard pace but stopped when he saw her struggling, offering water without comment, waiting until she was ready to continue. They made camp in a grove of pine where the wind couldn't reach. Jonah built a small fire and boiled coffee while Martha sat on a fallen log, too tired to feel anything but numb exhaustion. It gets easier, Jonah said, handing her a tin cup. Your body learns. How long did it take you? Years. He smiled faintly. But I was running from something. You're walking toward something. That makes a difference. The cabin appeared 3 days later, nestled where the spruce forest met a wall of gray stone. It was small, one room, a stone fireplace, oiled paper over the windows. Rough-hewn furniture, a bearskin on the floor, shelves lined with jars and tools. It smelled of wood smoke and leather and the deep quiet of places rarely visited. Martha set her bundle down and looked around, taking in the space that would become her home. It was nothing like the boarding house. Nothing like anywhere she'd ever lived. It was hers. Winter hits hard up here, Jonah said, stacking wood near the fireplace. We'll need to lay in meat, firewood, and water before the first snow. There's traps to set, pelts to prepare, repairs to make. He paused. I'll teach you what I can. The rest you'll learn by doing. Martha nodded, already feeling the magnitude of what she'd chosen. I'm not afraid of work. I know. But work up here isn't like work down there. Miss a step, and the mountain doesn't give warnings. It just takes. Over the following weeks, Martha learned what that meant. She learned to split wood without tearing the muscles in her back. To set snares where rabbits ran. To read the sky for storms that could trap them for days. To stretch a pelt so it dried without stiffening. To cook with what little they had and make it last. She made mistakes. Many of them. A poorly set snare that caught nothing. Firewood stacked wrong that got soaked in rain. Bread that came out hard as stone. Jonah never mocked her. He corrected, demonstrated, waited while she tried again. Hunger came in November, settling in like an unwelcome guest that wouldn't leave. The traps brought in less game than Jonah had hoped, and the stores they'd laid away suddenly seemed thin against the long winter ahead. Martha's stomach cramped at night, her body burning through energy faster than the small meals could replenish it. Doubt came with hunger. She'd wake in the darkness, listening to the wind tear at the cabin walls, and wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake. If pride had driven her to choose death in the mountains over humiliation in town. If she'd been foolish to think she could survive a world this harsh. But morning always came. And with it, work. Jonah taught her to read animal tracks in snow, the difference between a deer's print and an elk's, and how to tell if a trail was hours old or days old. He showed her which plants could be boiled into tea that helped with cold, which bark could be chewed to ease hunger pangs. He demonstrated how to use a knife not just for cutting, but for carving, scraping, shaping. Martha watched everything and remembered everything. Her hands, already strong from years of labor, grew stronger. Her movements became more efficient, less wasteful. She learned to think ahead, to see not just the task in front of her, but the 3 tasks that would follow. And slowly, something shifted inside her. It wasn't confidence, not yet. But it was the beginning of it, a quiet recognition that she was capable of more than she'd been allowed to believe. That strength wasn't something you were born with or without. It was something you built, day by day, through work that mattered. Jonah never praised her, but he noticed. She could tell by the way he'd step back and let her handle tasks he'd once done himself. By the way he'd ask her opinion before making a decision about where to set a trapline or how to ration their supplies. They spoke more now, in the evenings when the work was done and the fire burned low. Not about the past, neither of them wanted to carry those burdens into this new life. But about small things. About the way ice formed on the creek. About the stars visible through gaps in the clouds. About nothing and everything at once. One night, as they sat side by side mending gear, Martha said, "I never thanked you properly." Jonah glanced at her. "For what?" "For this. For offering me a choice when I didn't think I had one." He was quiet for a moment, his scarred hands working a leather strap through a buckle. "You gave yourself the choice when you walked out that door. I just pointed at a direction you could walk." "Still," Martha said. "Most people wouldn't have. Most people are cowards." Jonah's voice was matter-of-fact, without judgment or heat. "They see someone struggling and look away because helping means risk. Means opening yourself up to someone else's problems." He met her eyes. "But that's not living. That's just surviving, scared." Martha felt something warm settle in her chest, not romance, not yet, but something deeper. Respect. Recognition. The knowledge that she'd found someone who understood what it meant to stand when it would be easier to walk away. December brought the first real snow, 3 feet in a single night, drifting against the cabin walls, turning the world into something silent and vast. They were trapped inside for 4 days, burning through firewood, rationing food, telling stories to pass the time. Jonah told her about the years he'd spent alone, about why he'd chosen the mountains over people. Martha told him about her parents, about the father who'd taught her to work with her hands and the mother who died coughing blood one winter when medicine was too expensive and dignity too cheap. They shared their stories like supplies, carefully, honestly, holding nothing back because there was no point in pretense when survival depended on truth. Spring came late, breaking through the frozen ground with reluctant warmth. The passes cleared slowly, revealing trails that had been buried for months. Jonah checked his traplines, finding them mostly intact, and began preparing for the trip down to trade his winter's worth of pelts. But trouble arrived before they could leave. Jonah saw the signs first, tracks too fresh, too numerous, converging on paths that shouldn't have seen traffic. Boot prints pressed deep, angry. Men moving without care for concealment, driven by something other than caution. "We've got company coming," he said one evening, his voice calm but serious. "Maybe 10 men. Timber thieves, most likely. Pushed off their claim and looking for somewhere to winter late." Martha's stomach tightened. "What do we do?" "We don't fight them straight on." Jonah was already moving, gathering their best supplies, the seed stores, the salt and ammunition. 10 men with nothing to lose will take this cabin without thinking twice. But 10 tired, hungry, frightened men might decide it's not worth it. They worked through the night, moving their critical stores to a cache higher up the mountain, a place Jonah had prepared years ago for emergencies. They erased obvious tracks, scattered ashes in a creek to confuse the trail, and laid out a careful pattern of signs, some hidden, some deliberately visible. Jonah moved through the forest like he was part of it, showing Martha where to step to leave no trace, where to pause and listen. His breathing had grown labored, and she noticed him favoring his left side, but he didn't slow down. "The land does most of the work," he explained quietly. "Men get tired. They get cold. They start doubting. All you have to do is give them reasons to doubt a little more." Over the next 2 days, Jonah prepared the terrain. He built deadfalls that looked natural, branches positioned to collapse under weight, rocks balanced on slopes that would tumble at the slightest disturbance. He laid false trails that led to difficult terrain, brushed out real paths to make them invisible. He hung old markers, weathered, half-rotted signs, suggesting the area had been claimed for years by someone with resources. Martha helped where she could, following his instructions precisely, learning to see the forest the way he did, not as scenery, but as a tool. The men arrived on the 3rd day, just as the sun was setting. Martha and Jonah watched from a ridge above the cabin, concealed in a thicket of pine. The men were rough, loud, arguing among themselves even before they reached the door. They kicked it open and claimed the space with the entitlement of people who'd stopped caring about rules. Jonah didn't approach. He let them settle in, let them eat the small stores he deliberately left behind, let them start feeling secure. Then, at dusk, he showed himself, just for a moment, high on the opposite ridge, silhouetted against the dying light. Long enough to be seen. Not long enough to be caught. The men shouted, grabbed their rifles, but by the time they organized themselves, Jonah had vanished. That night, he loosened stones above their camp. Not enough to kill, just enough to send rocks tumbling past their fire, close enough to feel dangerous. The men scrambled, cursing, looking up into darkness that gave no answers. Jonah moved through the trees like smoke, coughing quietly into his sleeve, his body shaking with cold and exhaustion. Martha kept watch from their hidden camp, a rifle across her lap, tea ready for when he returned. On the 2nd night, Jonah dragged a heavy log across the main trail leading up to the cabin, slow work that left him wheezing. It suggested more men, a larger operation, people willing to defend their territory. He scratched marks into trees, old marks, made to look weathered. Boundary markers. Warning signs. By the third morning, the men were fracturing. One had broken his ankle on a slope Jonah had deliberately iced with creek water during the night, painful but not lethal. Another had heard echoes in a narrow canyon that sounded like voices, like men waiting in ambush, when it was only the wind and clever placement of sound. Martha watched Jonah return from his final night of work, and her chest tightened with worry. He was limping badly, his face gray beneath the beard, his breathing wet and rattling. He'd fallen, she realized. Somewhere in the dark, exhaustion and cold had taken their toll. "It's done," he said, collapsing near their small fire. "They'll leave today." And they did. By noon, the men were arguing loudly enough that their voices carried up the mountain. By mid-afternoon, they were moving down the trail, leaving behind tools and supplies in their hurry to escape a threat they'd never fully seen but had become convinced was real. Jonah watched them go, then let himself collapse fully. Martha caught him, feeling the fever burning through his shirt, hearing the wheeze in every breath. "You're hurt," she said. "Cracked rib." "Maybe two." He coughed, wincing. "Fell on the rocks 2 nights back. Didn't want to worry you." "You stubborn fool." "Worked, didn't it?" It had. But the cost was written in every line of his face, in the way he couldn't stand without help, in the illness settling into his chest like winter ice. Martha spent the next week nursing him, forcing tea down his throat, keeping him warm, listening to his breathing grow rough and then, slowly, begin to clear. She did the work he couldn't do, checking traps, maintaining the cabin, keeping watch in case the men returned. They didn't. When Jonah finally recovered enough to sit up without coughing blood, he looked at her with something new in his eyes. Not gratitude, that was too simple. Recognition. Partnership proven not in words but in action. "We make a good team," he said quietly. "We do. I'd like it to stay that way. Permanent like." He paused, choosing his words with the same care he used for everything else. "Not because you need protection. Not because I need helping. But because of what we've built here, it's worth keeping." Martha understood what he was asking. Marriage, yes. But not the kind sold in churches or sanctioned by towns that had never seen value in either of them. This was something earned through shared work, through respect given and returned, through choosing each other when it would have been easier to stay alone. "Yes," she said simply. They spoke their vows to the mountains, with no witnesses but the wind and the trees. No ceremony. No pretense. Just 2 people making a promise that mattered because they'd already proven they could keep it. When summer came and the passes were fully clear, they made the trip down to Rahid Creek one final time. They walked together, side by side, Martha no longer hunched or hurrying, Jonah no longer solitary. The town looked smaller than Martha remembered. The people stared, at her especially, trying to reconcile the woman they dismissed with the one who now met their eyes without flinching. Mrs. Garvin saw her on the street and opened her mouth to speak. Martha simply nodded and kept walking. There was nothing left to say to people who'd never wanted to listen. They traded Jonah's pelts, bought what supplies they needed, and left before sunset. The cabin waited for them where spruce met stone, and they returned to it with relief. To work that mattered. To a partnership built on honesty and respect. To a life they'd chosen deliberately, without illusion or rescue. They stood together on the porch that evening, watching the light fade over the mountains, and felt the quiet satisfaction of people who'd found their place in the world, not by being given it, but by building it with their own hands. Martha and Jonah found strength in the mountains, not in rescue, but in respect. If their story moved you, let us know in the comments below. And if you want more true tales from the Wild West, hit that subscribe button. Thanks for listening.